Track limits were super controversial in Austria as drivers kept pushing their luck and losing lap times. However, even though there was time to be gained there, the runoff areas weren't nearly as wide as Paul Ricard. And if similar standards are applied at the French GP, then there's gonna be some serious trouble brewing for the grid. So, do we have an actual crisis on our hands? Well, let's find out. First up, Red Bull Ring was a track limits disaster. The Austrian Grand Prix usually produces some pretty great racing, thanks to its multiple DRS zones and sharp corners. However, thanks to the track's layout and runoff areas, a lot of drivers try to get as close to the curbs as possible. In fact, most of them would probably hop straight over if they could. Why, you ask? Well, you see, when you're turning through a sharp corner, having a wider angle of attack can result in better traction off the exit. So, running off the track means that you get a faster exit, which obviously carries into the next straight. However, there's only so much pace you can eke out before running out of tarmac. Also, it's kind of dangerous to hop over curves anyway, since you could damage the floor. Now, the FIA obviously knows these things and sets boundaries for drivers. Like, if every driver started to go onto the runoff area, then what's the point of the track anymore? We mean, runoff areas are designed to be your last resort escape after a lockup or understeer, rather than instruments to gain lap times. But then again, this isn't a problem on most tracks. Red Bull Ring, on the other hand, was a strange outlier over the weekend as FIA continued to dish out track limit warnings like there's no tomorrow. Like, we even saw Sergio Perez dip out of the top 10 in qualifying just because his lap time got deleted, and the rules were so strict that you get penalized even if you went an inch outside the white line. Oh, and let's not even open up the can of worms that's the time penalties during the race, because there were just way too many of those. Why doesn't this happen at other tracks though? Also, you've got to wonder, if the drivers know that they're going to get penalized, why don't they just stay within the limits? Kinda weird, right? Up next, the paddock gives its verdict on track limits. Now, as you could probably guess, the teams and the drivers didn't really like the fact that they were being penalized for crossing the white line. After all, they'd done the same thing at every other circuit this season, so it didn't make sense for the FIA to tighten its grip at Austria. As a matter of fact, reigning Drivers' World Champion Max Verstappen even went as far as to call the FIA's policing a joke. And generally, there was a lot of dissidence from everyone, including the likes of Pierre Gasly, Mick Schumacher, and Sergio Perez. Oh, and if you're thinking that only those who got time penalties were mad, then you'd be wrong, because literally every driver was being warned about the white lines over the weekend. For context, the governing body reported over 40 incidents of drivers leaving the track during the race at Red Bull Ring, which is an insanely high number. Also, of course, a lot of them were given time penalties for their off-track shenanigans too. Why was that runoff tarmac so hard for everyone to resist though? Well, according to Red Bull boss Christian Horner, it's to do with how the track's laid out. Speaking to the press ahead of the French GP, he said that the Red Bull Ring invites drivers to push the track limits since there's a ton of time to be gained there. Obviously, if you get away with it, then you've gained some precious tenths on a single corner. But if the FIA catches you, then you'd lose your lap time. Like, it's a risk and reward game, which evidently most drivers are willing to play. Now, is Paul Ricard gonna be even worse than Austria? Despite being one of the widest tracks on the calendar, Paul Ricard isn't known for its great racing action. Don't get us wrong, it's a decent enough track, but the layout just isn't good enough to produce exciting action. Plus, it's not a good-looking circuit either, with its massive runoff areas and those blue and red stripes. Like, honestly, it kinda looks like a parking lot more than a racetrack. With that said, there's just way too much empty space on it, which allows some drivers to take creative liberties when it comes to track limits. And according to Christian Horner, that's gonna be a massive problem this weekend. In his press conference, the Red Bull boss said that the French GP could devolve into a policing crisis, since you've got acres of runoff tarmac, which obviously just means that everyone's going to be doing it. Are we actually going to see a similar level of penalties being handed out though? Well, again, that depends on how the drivers treat the track. If you look at past races at the circuit, then there's definitely a pretty good chance of another time penalty fiesta. But wait, what do the fans think about these penalties? It's pretty easy to wrap your head around the fact that F1 drivers hate track limits policing. After all, anything that slows them down or pushes them into a box is bad. However, are these time penalties actually a bad thing? Like, aren't they designed to make sure that no one gains an unfair advantage on track? Well, according to most fans, FIA's rules should be as clear as they could be. Plus, if they say that anyone who goes over the white line would get penalized, then there shouldn't be any difference between someone who's 5 inches over the line and someone who's 5 feet over it. Besides, this kind of sets the standard for everyone, reducing reducing the number of instances where you'd see drivers run off the track to get a better exit. We mean, if the FIA started to allow this stuff week in and week out, then it'd open a whole other level of Pandora's box that we're just not ready for yet. Oh, and let's not forget, Paul Ricard isn't the most exciting racetrack on the calendar, so being lenient with the rules is only going to make it more boring. Plus, it's a part of your racecraft to push the limits while staying within the rules anyway. So honestly, if someone goes over and gets a penalty, then they probably had it coming. With that said, why are FIA standards so different at each track? If you don't remember, track limits and white lines were a major issue last season, as people never knew what was allowed and what wasn't. Plus, the FIA was also super vague about the rules, and they kept changing every other weekend. Heading into this season, however, the sporting bodies kind of laid out its plans in simple terms, saying that anyone who crosses the white line on track would be penalized. Now, saying that's easy, but implementing this change is a whole another story. You see, the thing is that it's not about the white line at all. Like, you could rewind back to Silverstone just a few weeks ago and see tons of drivers going off the road. So why didn't they get any time penalties? Well, you see, it's all about whether someone gained a time advantage or not. For instance, if your runoff area improves your exit speed, then you've gained an advantage. Usually at most tracks, though, drivers tend to lose time if they go off, which means that there's no need to add insult to injury by throwing another penalty on top. And finally, does the rulebook need to be more consistent? Now, Formula One's always been a sport where teams try to bend the rules to gain an advantage over the competition. Like, there's an inherent part of the sport and the car building exercise as it results in some serious trickery and innovation. At the same time, though, the vagueness of the rulebook also means that there's a lot of room for error on the FIA's part. For instance, we don't even have to go back very far, as last year's season closer has been well documented for the race director's strange decision on the final lap. Do things need to be more consistent in the sport, though? We mean, if Michael Masi didn't reinterpret the safety car rules, then we probably would have had a different world champion right now, which is obviously a massive deal in and of itself. Also, this year's shift to rotating directors means that every race feels different and unpredictable. And honestly, no one really knows what course of action the FIA is going to take in case of an incident. Obviously, some people might enjoy this unpredictability, but the majority of fans want the driving to be the main focus of a race weekend, rather than some technicalities and regulations. Besides, it kind of takes the fun away from a race win too, if you reach the checkered flag off the back of a controversial decision. So we'd say that some major work needs to be done for both track limits and race direction to bring more consistency into the sport. What do you think, though? Should teams be allowed to creatively exploit certain rules and gain an advantage? Let us know in the comments below. Make sure to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more videos like this. See you in the next one.